All right, welcome back everyone to Runner's Roundtable. Today I am speaking to Katherine Campbell, or Kat. She is a runner, personal trainer, physical therapist, right? Like you do a
hmm
little bit of everything, which I appreciate so much because one of the things that I always come back to for myself and for people I talk to is that runner means being more than just a person who runs. There's a lot, just a lot of things that kind of come into how successful you are when you lace up your shoes and you go out the door or head on the treadmill and actually run. So, first question is for you to introduce yourself to us and tell us a little bit about your running story.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. I'm so happy to be here. Yeah, I am Katherine Campbell. I am mostly just a physical therapist at this point. I was doing personal training when I was in PT school and also got my running coaching certification when I was in PT school. But I started running a long time ago. So I'm 26. I started running when I was like 15. I started running more so on the treadmill. What actually ended up happening was when I was in high school, my dad had a heart attack.
Mm,
And so, I mean, he was okay. He's still okay. But one of the things that had happened was obviously after that, the doctors were like, you have to be healthier, you have to eat healthier, you have to, exercise more. And so my whole family started to kind of try and be more conscious about our health. And that's when I started going to the gym. And I would literally just run on the treadmill, do like 3 miles, like 3, 4 days a week. And I just really, really liked it. So I kept doing it for years and years and like very consistently all throughout high school, would just run on the treadmill, just my time to, kind of be by myself, put some my headphones on and some good music. And then during COVID 2020, obviously I could not go to the gym anymore. And
mm,
so that's when I started running outside because there has not been a time where I have taken like more than a week off from running. So there was no option. Like if I didn't have a treadmill, and which I was used to, that's what I started with. So I didn't mind it. I was like, okay, I'm going to run outside. And then there, I had some more extra time. I was running longer distances. Just really, really fell in love with being outside, getting the fresh air, having the sun on my skin and on my face. And then from there, I was like, okay, like, well, I've always wanted to do longer distance races. I just never thought I could. And then that's
mm.
when I kind of got into the racing scene of like, okay, let me try a half marathon. I've done 5Ks before, but let me try a half marathon and then let me try a marathon. And then from there, that's when I realized like at that point I was already in PT school. And so I'm like, okay, I want running to be a very, very important big part of what I do with my career. And so that's kind of how it all started.
How was that transition for you from treadmill, primarily treadmill, to then going out in the roads? Because I feel like we often hear the road runners how much they struggle with the treadmill, like going from outside to inside. So I'm curious because I hear that and well, I think of, when I was younger, I would run on a treadmill. It was very similar where I'm like, oh, I'm just going to get on the treadmill at the gym for 30 minutes, see how it goes. And it's just so different. Now,
Yeah.
I mean, now at this point, I'm like, oh, I absolutely I live in Miami and Miami, Florida, and I would rather deal with the heat outside, even if it's
Mhm.
ridiculously hot, than get on a treadmill. So, how was that transition for you?
Yeah, no, same. Yeah, it was funny because when I started on the treadmill, I'm like, I cannot do outside. And I think part of it was also the fact that, like, as someone who is younger, everyone's like, oh my God, don't run outside. It's so bad for your joints. And
Ugh.
it's just so much more, just everything like forces on everything. So, what happened was as soon as I started running outside, it was a little weirder. Like I felt like, you didn't have that compliance of the treadmill. But
Mhm.
now I hate running on the treadmill. I don't run
That's
on the
so fun.
treadmill.
Now you're like, nope, I've
No, I
gotten a taste
can't.
of outside, no
Yeah.
more.
No, I can totally see why people prefer to run outside because now there is just something about like I love running in general, but there is something about being outside and just, I feel like physically getting the outside fresh air, no matter if it's hot
Mm.
or cold. Like right now, I'm from New Jersey, so right now it's starting to get really cold, and I prefer the heat. Like I rather be in Florida, but yeah, I think that running outside has been kind of, I can't imagine doing anything else now. I don't like the treadmill unless I absolutely have to. But I think again, like, it's nice to have the option, especially like for you, if you're in Florida, you don't probably have as many hills. So I think that
Yeah,
the treadmill can be beneficial sometimes, but it just, I guess it depends on the situation.
right. Now, I'm curious, your professional response to that question of, oh, it's bad for your knees or bad on your joints. I mean,
Yeah.
you literally know this stuff. How do you
Hmm.
respond when people say that?
It's my biggest pet peeve, I think. Like that's my
Yeah.
number one thing, because you know what? One of the reasons why I decided to be a physical therapist who specializes with runners is because I've been there. I was always a runner before I was a physical therapist. And so I had many people telling me that all the time, that it was so bad for your joints. And back then I had no idea. I just kind of listened to whoever was older than me, but like with more research and stuff, they're actually saying that running is actually good for your joints, especially if you're a recreational runner. I think there's a certain threshold, but if you're comparing a regular couch potato to a recreational runner who runs half marathons, it's actually better for your joints. Just like if you were to squat, like people at first were like, oh, squatting is bad for your knees, but that deep squat is actually really good for your knees. So, yeah, I think it's now, I think more people are talking about it more, so I don't have to explain myself as much, but it definitely is one of my biggest pet peeves as a runner, because it is something that I've definitely heard several times. And now I just, at this point, I have so many research articles and stuff where I just pull it out and say like, listen, that's not what they're saying anymore, you know?
I love that. It's like a deck of cards, and you're like, all right, just pick a card, pick one of
Yeah.
these research studies. It'll tell you what you want to hear. And I love that because that is definitely one of the things where when people say, oh, your knees, I get people always focus in on the knees. And I'm like, but again, when you're running, you're using a whole host of joints, right?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
no one says your ankles, right? Like no
Right.
one
Right.
says anything about your
Yeah.
ankles or your hips, which are two other joints that are real
Yeah.
important here. But it's the knees. It's always the knees. And I love that there is more research that's coming out on that because I've seen
Hmm.
similar research where there is that sweet spot of being active and having it be protective of the joints or just give the joints a little bit of boost for longevity. So
Yeah.
I I really appreciate that. Hey, if you can share
No.
some of those articles with me, I would love it because I'm like that talk about one of the biggest myths of running.
Yeah. And I think also like the knees is almost gets stuck as being like the middleman of like, you have things going on you have things going on your ankle, but because it's in the middle, that's usually where people will feel it, right? And sometimes people will be like, oh, well then why when I every time I run it hurts my knees? There's so many different factors that contribute to the knee, as
Yeah.
well as the fact that like I think that just because running, like oh, someone runs and it hurts their knees, I also feel like there's other things you can do to decrease some of the forces. Like it's not like the forces are bad, but if running causes, some knee pain, well then let's work on seeing if you're overstriding. And those things can definitely contribute to knee pain, right? But doesn't mean that it's bad for your knees.
Right, right. That's a beautiful distinction because it's whenever someone tells me something is hurting, I'm like, okay, well, let's look at the muscles above and the muscles below. Because sometimes, yeah, that knee pain is actually an imbalance in your glute or that you're not activating the glutes enough. So I love that you bring that
Yes.
up to
Yeah.
people where you're like, okay, but wait, let's kind of pause and take a look at the overall picture because sometimes it is as simple as, oh, you're overstriding. So it's not
Yeah.
really your knee, it's the entire chain of your body in motion
Right.
where you're seeing that.
100%. Yes. And I think that's why I love working with runners, because it's so holistic you think that you're like only focusing on one thing. And that's like just with anything, like someone comes with in for an injury, like, yeah, they might have Achilles tendonitis or something, but you have to look at so many different factors if you're really treating the runner as a whole. And a lot of times people don't. And that's with coaching, that's with PT, that's with anything, right? But I think that's what's really, really important to recognize when working with runners.
Yeah. And it kind of goes back to very much a central theme of, I mean, you said it, you have to treat the runner as a whole. It's
Yeah.
not just the run workouts. Like there's more to being a runner. And I always just, that's my thing. I always come back to, I'm like, y'all, there's more to being a runner than running.
Yeah, for sure.
How did you get into run coaching?
Yeah, so I was in PT school. And what happened was I didn't even like at the time, very beginning of PT school, I didn't even know there was PTs that can specialize in something or like work with runners, right? So I was finishing up my last year of PT school and we had to start looking at our last year of clinical rotations. And at my school where I went, Sacred Heart University in Connecticut, um, you can choose your last rotation to be a choice rotation. And so we were looking through like a bunch of options I had. And I'm from North Jersey. So I'm like right outside, like 15 minutes outside of New York City. And so what happened was I was looking through this list and I remember my professor being like, oh, this one's interesting if you like running. And it's this clinical that mostly sees runners. I would say like 95% of the people there were running. So it's like, oh, that's interesting. And I'm like right outside of New York City. Let me see how far it is from my house. It was like maybe like a 45-minute commute, which is really good if you're going
Right.
into New York City. Yeah. So what happened was I had that rotation. I ended up getting my last rotation before I graduated PT school. And I saw that a lot of them were run coaches. And I at that point I was like, okay, I already know I want to work with runners. Like, what can I do now that will help me in the future when I'm actually a PT? And so I saw a lot of them had their RRCA certification. So I was like, okay, I'm going to get my RRCA certification. And at that point, I already had people asking me, like, can you make me plans? But
Yep.
I was like, can I? Probably. Yeah, I could. But I kind of wanted that certification just for added, I don't know,
To
just
make it
to be a
official.
little more official. Yeah, to be more
Yeah.
official. And so I got it before I started the clinical rotation. And that way it just, I almost started kind of coaching by just working on mileage and stuff with injured runners, right? So it was more so, okay, well, you want to keep running, you have knee pain, and trying to figure out the right volume where they can continue running and say, okay, now it's time to work in hills. Now it's time to work in speed work. Now we can start doing longer runs in general. And that's kind of how my coaching started. It wasn't typically like performance. It was like getting you back from an injury. And then after that, I'm now do online run coaching on the side, separate from my job. And now I'm just pretty much working with runners, from people who were like, oh, I had an injury or I had like a bad race or I was supposed to do this race and then I got hurt, where I do that as well as people who I just want to qualify for Boston, so a little wide range, but it's nice because it gives me an opportunity to work with a bunch of different types of runners and have different goals to kind of choose from. So
Yeah. And it gives you an opportunity to really be creative, right? Because
yeah, for sure.
the goals, the running goals of someone who's qualifying for Boston are very different than the running goals of someone who's coming back from an injury. So it
Right.
really, you are
Right.
running the gamut of it. And I love how it all came together for you, right? Where you're
Yeah.
like, okay, I've been running since I was 15, and then I started PT school, and then here is this clinical that's very close to my house, and this
I
is what I'm
know.
seeing. So like it all just blended so nicely together because I always say that part of being a coach is, or not always say, I say it in my head. Maybe I don't say it out loud, but I definitely say it in my head where it's like part of being a coach is very much so like you have to embody being a runner. Like you have to know what it
Yes.
feels like to do those different
Yes.
workouts because when you communicate it to your athletes, like you know that what you're giving them is challenging. Like you're not
Yeah.
you're not just making stuff up because you have no clue. You know that it's challenging, but at the same time, you know that there's a purpose behind the challenge to get them closer to their goals. So to me, it's just, I'm like, oh, they get like a nice little extra punch from you
Right.
because there is that deeper understanding of
Yes.
the body and
Mm-hmm.
how the body works. So that's to me, it's, I just love when people are multi hyphenated or multi
Yeah.
passionate, because it does come in handy.
I think it's cool too, like going back to what you said. Yeah, I've been a runner for a long time, and like just everything that kind of happened in my life kind of led me to this. It like almost like not fell into my lap, but like everything that I did in my life, it did get me closer to this, which I thought was really cool. And then ultimately, like, you know, I've been there as a patient, like at PT, and someone tells me, oh, like, well, I'm like, well, how can I start running again? My knee hurts. And they're like, well, just stop running. Like, that's not the answer a runner wants to hear, right? And so I think I just get more buy-in from runners when I'm like practicing what I preach. Like, yes, you need to strength train. And yes, I'm running and I'm training for a marathon and I have no pain. And I am a runner. So I understand that it's really important for you to get back to running. And so I think you just in general, whether you're a run coach or a PT or whatever, and you're working with runners and you run, you get a little bit more buy-in from the runners because they know, like, okay, she knows what she's talking about because she actually is a runner. Like she gets it. And that's what I like a lot of my like listen, oh, running is like mental outlet to be able to just get away from things. And I know you want to get back to running, but this is what you have to do. And I get it because I've been there, right? I've been there where someone told me like just stop running. There is a better alternative. You have to be willing to put in the work. So
Yeah, I was going to say that's also like a really, it's an interesting population to work with when we're talking about injured runners, because I think on the one hand, very motivated to get back into running. So they'll do
yeah.
like everything. And I'll say this for myself, right? Where it's like, okay, I really want to get back to running. So give me all the exercises. I'll do it all. Like if you're telling me
Yeah.
it's going to take 3 weeks to fully recover, I'm going to be like, but wait, can I work extra so that it only takes two
Yeah.
weeks? Right.
Yeah.
Like, so
That's the
there
type
is,
of people runners are. That's why I love it.
because they're so committed. So I'm
Yeah.
curious with the people that you work with, and this is why I'm kind of bringing that up, because I feel like an injured runner is really committed to
Yeah.
getting better,
Yeah.
but a quote unquote healthy runner is not very committed to doing the stuff that's going to keep them healthy. So
No.
if you're working with people, you know, if you're helping, let's say the example is, you know, you have, I'm coming to you and I'm an injured runner and I really, really like, I have, what's the most common thing that you see with runners?
Knees. Something knee pain or
Okay.
Achilles, I would
Yeah.
say.
All right. So let's assume like I have runner's knee or something like
Yeah.
that. And I'm
Yeah.
like, all right, Kat, like I really, really, I have this knee. It hurts every time I run.
Yeah.
It's been hurting for a few weeks now. It's gotten to the point where like I actually have to walk. I can't, I can run for a little bit, but I have to walk because the pain is just so much. But I signed up for this half marathon at the beginning of March. At the beginning
That's
of March.
so typical.
Okay.
So typical.
So in that case, like, how do I get there? Because again, I knowing myself, I'm going to be really committed to get myself back to feeling
Right.
great. But as someone who's coaching me, how do you get me one to the start line if you think that's an appropriate goal to have?
Mm-hmm.
And then how do you get me to continue doing the things, not get me right, because obviously like I'm my own
Yeah.
person and I'm gonna decide that, but how do you plant that motivation to continue doing the less glamorous parts of
Yeah.
running?
Okay. Well, yeah. That's a very typical situation. Let me just say that. I think first off, especially when someone comes in with an injury, right? Every single person's different. And I feel like I runner for that example specifically, some start better pretty quick. So I would like to see in like a week giving them extra doing it every day, how quickly the pain goes down. because yes, it could be possible and they could have no pain. But I think one of the first I start off with situation, right? My biggest thing as a coach, as a physical therapist, is like, I want to completely explain everything, completely inform the patient, the runner, whatever, of all the risks to benefits. Like, I know you want to run a race and you could possibly run no pain, and that's fine. I want to also make sure you know that you could also run it with more pain. Like, you could get through it. You could probably, yeah, you could finish the race, but you might be in some pain. And there's like, we'll do what we can afterwards, but you need to be fully aware of that because this is just like not enough time. And sometimes that's okay for people because sometimes it's more just like, I want to run this race. I want to run it with my friends. I want to run it with my family. This was something I set out to do a long time ago. And so that's number one. I always, no matter what, I always like to completely inform people. Like, I just had a client the other day who was like getting back from some hip stuff, and he's like, has a half marathon in March, but he's like, can we do one in February? I'm looking at one in February. I'm like, all right, well, do you prefer to, like, do you absolutely need to run this race? Or would you rather be a little bit more conservative and kind of guarantee that you'll feel good? He's like, conservative. Okay. That's it. So that's number one. I like to really, really make sure that they make the decision, but they know what they're kind of going up against if it doesn't go the best way possible. After that, after let's say they've gotten better, they're feeling better, I think honestly, what I've seen with a lot of my patients is after a little bit of consistency because of their injury, they notice the benefits of doing the less glamorous things. Like, I don't even need to explain it to them. They just see it. Like, I have one person right now and she's awesome. She's just also very, very well informed. Like, she came in knowing like, I need someone, a PT who knows runners. I want someone who is a runner. I know that I need to do these exercises. Doesn't mean I have consistently done them beforehand, but I know I should. So there's also different types of people. But for her, for example, she has been doing more prehab at this point. Like, she's completely fine. She just comes in once a month, once every 2-3 weeks to just get a new home exercise plan, strength plan to do like 2 times per week. And she literally tells people all the time, I don't even say anything. She's like, I feel so much faster. I feel so much stronger going up hills. My pace is naturally faster at the same effort. And I've never felt so good before running. And that's, I don't have to say anything.
Yeah.
So after a certain point, I feel like I'm hoping part of it is the consistency of doing it. They're just used to doing it. But I also think a lot of people see the benefits after consistently doing it, which is good about the injury. But I wish I could get people there beforehand. A lot of runners will typically wait until it's like literally the worst it could be. And then you have to kind of, do what you can to try and make them hit their goals, and they're running through more pain if they just came in earlier, stuff like that. But yeah, I would typically say I think a lot of times I don't really have to do much convincing afterwards. So they see the benefits.
Right. It's almost like you're taking people uphill, right? Where it's
Yeah.
like, all right, we're working on this. I know it's not fun, it's not glamorous. And then it's like once they get to the top and they see how good it feels, then it's like, all right, like let's do this. It
Yeah.
is just part of it. And that's the interesting thing too, right? Where it's like I'm going to assume that these exercises or whatever they can do, it's not something that is very time consuming. It's not like you're saying, hey, go be in the gym for an hour focusing on like your glutes. It's probably at least, I'm speaking from my experience where like the exercises they're not complicated. Whenever I've
No.
had issues, like it's really just, if I can give myself 20 minutes to really focus on either, like banded squats or whatever the
Mm-hmm.
case is, something like that, where it does make such a difference. It's just harder to put it into the routine. And
Right.
also just even convincing people that sometimes, hey, just cut your run short by a
Yeah.
mile and do the work instead, right?
Mm-hmm.
And again, it kind of goes back to this idea of being a runner means more than just running. But
Yes, 100%. I think also it's like very functional exercises, right? Like the things that I give people are very specific to running. Like if you're running, you're constantly in single leg stance. I tell this all the time to my patients. You're constantly in single leg stance. There's never a time that you have 2 feet on the ground. And so you got to train like that. You have to be training a lot of single leg stance in like standing up. Like we're not just doing clamshells. So
yeah,
um I think that that's one. And I will tell people too, like to what they you can just week little strength training that puts you at so much better at all. And it doesn't mean like this insane amount of time. You're right. Like
right.
if people say they have a busy schedule and they can really only do 30 minutes of strength training, all right, we'll make it work. We'll give you exercises. But you also have to communicate that with your provider is, or who your run coach is, whoever is writing plan. They need to know that, make it individualized to you. And I think that's always number one, because everyone's lives are different, right? And everyone is busy in different ways. So
Yeah, it's true. And I love that um which kind of goes back to my question, right? Of like, how do you get people to do it? And you said it, it's really they have to make a decision as to what their goal is, because once they make that decision, then they'll be accountable for it. Because there is
yeah.
a very big difference between you saying, hey, I think you need to do these exercises, and having that conversation with them of, okay, what is your goal? What is it that you want to get out of this? Now, can you commit to that, right? That person who wants to run the race in February, when in March, that was like the initial goal race. It does take a lot of talking to people and helping even them get clear as to what they want. And I think that's a very
Yes.
important part of the coaching relationship too, where people think that, oh, they're going to hire you as a coach and you're just going to get a plan and then you're done. And it's like, no,
Yeah.
there's actually a little bit more that happens in this relationship.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes it is that it is helping people figure out what are their goals and what are they willing to, I guess, postpone or
Mm-hmm.
put aside or sacrifice in order to reach that goal. And that's sometimes a hard conversation, especially when I feel like now there's just so much more information out there, or there's so
Mm-hmm.
many more races, and
Yeah.
everyone's doing something at some point, and it's like, oh, there's just a lot. Like it's a really exciting time to be a runner right now,
Yeah.
because there's so much information out there and because there's so many different events. But it does take someone like a coach like yourself to be like, okay, let's kind of rein it in a little bit and really focus, what is it that we want to do.
Yeah. A lot of times I feel like people don't necessarily know that one of the important goals they have is injury prevention until they've gotten hurt. Like a lot of times people were training for something and then got hurt, couldn't do their race, were in extreme amounts of pain, and then they realized like, oh, this is something that I actually really care about. It should be a goal. But if you've never been through an injury, you don't make it a priority until you've already had an injury, right? And so one of the things too is that for me, I don't take clients unless they're willing to strength train. Like that's no ands, ifs, or buts. Like whether I create your strength plan, you go to a personal trainer, or you know how to exercise and strength train, I do not take people unless they're willing to. Because at the end of the day, I will always focus on their goals. But my goal as someone who got into this profession to help people avoid injuries and to help people through injuries is that I don't want to work with a runner who is not going to do everything they possibly can to avoid getting hurt. Because for me, I practice what I preach. So I want my clients to do the same. I want them to do everything they need to do to be the best runner. So yeah.
I appreciate and love that so much, because it's even for me right now, it's this light. I just had a light bulb moment here where Yeah. It's like every training cycle, the goal is to not like one of the main goals is to not get injured. But I feel like we don't really think about that. I'm even thinking back to I'm running the London Marathon with a
That's
charity.
awesome. Ah,
Thank you.
congrats. That's so
Thank
exciting.
you. Thank you. And we had one of our group meetings, like they're going to do monthly group meetings in the lead up to the race. And the very first meeting, the they have like a run coach, PT type person, strength coach, that's a resource for all the charity runners. And in the meeting,
Mhm.
he said it. He's like, my goal is to get you all to the start line as healthy as possible because 25, he said that like in the group that, or in his experience, 25% of the runners don't make it to the start line because of an injury.
That's
And I was like,
crazy.
oh, that's that. So I've had that in my mind. And then what you just said of an important goal is injury prevention. I'm like, right. And how much of us don't, we don't think about that. Like
No,
don't think about
no.
that. And it is a
Because
goal,
if you're
right?
lucky, you're fine. If you're one of the lucky ones, that's fine. But eventually, you do tell people as you age, it will catch up to you at one point.
Oh,
And
yeah.
people don't also, I've been having this conversation with a lot of people recently too. Runners don't necessarily realize how much they miss running, just running in general for their mind and their
Mm-hmm.
body until they get hurt. Like a lot of times, runners will start to get really fixated on like, I don't want to lose fitness. I'm training for this race, or I need to run because I need to get faster for this. And then they get hurt. And then they're like, shoot, I don't even care about that. Yeah, like that sucks. But it's more the fact that I just miss running. And now I just feel like I don't have this mental outlet to be able to do something I love. And then they just get, they're itching to run. And then people tell them to swim or bike or walk and
Yeah.
they get mad.
Well, now that you say that, it's kind of, it's making me realize, how much of a privilege it is for us to focus on those time goals, right? Like
Yeah.
the time goals aren't a given, but the one thing that we can work on is making sure that we are strong enough to chase those goals,
Yeah.
right? Like that is so that is so great. And I also just appreciate how and I think that's one of the, and this goes into a question that I have for you as to how you have evolved as a coach,
Mm-hmm.
because I don't know if when you first started out, you were like, yes, I'll be a coach to everyone. Or did you start off saying, no, I can be your coach. One, if it fits and it makes sense, but also like, I can be your coach, but you have to do the strength training. Because I don't think, or I don't know. I mean, I feel like maybe more run coaches are kind of coming around to the idea of strength training and like making that a requirement, but not every run coach out there is going to say what you just said about no, if you're not going to do some kind of strength training program, I'm not the coach for you. So
Yeah.
how did you get to that point where you can confidently say that and own that about yourself as a coach?
Yeah. I think, you know, for me, I think it's a little different because when I started running, I also started strength training. So it was never like I ran first and then I started getting into strength training. So I can completely understand how sometimes it's hard for runners who only ran to then go into strength training. That is hard, and sometimes scary, right? But because I've always done both, and then I went straight into exercise science was my undergrad degree, and then PT
Mm.
school. I just always knew how important it was. And from an injury prevention standpoint, I've always knew like I've been there where I couldn't run and I need to do the exercises. And I just remember the feelings like of not being able to run. And so for me, it was always like, I feel like it evolved before I even was a run coach. Like I always knew, okay, if I have a client, okay, if you can strength train on your own, that's fine, but you better be strength training. And I'm going to be checking that too on final search. So
Right.
I feel like for me, it was always, nope, you need to strength train. Um, yeah, just because again, I'm trying to avoid them from feeling the feelings I felt not being able to run. And a lot of times I'm advocating for them without them even knowing, because it is a really sucky feeling not being able to run, you know? So I think it's just something that I think everyone should do. And so for me, it was always a no-brainer. Like, if you don't want to strength train, then I'm not the right person for you, because I don't want you to get hurt and then look to strength training as the answer, because that's ultimately what would happen, you know,
Mhm.
where eventually you are going to have to strength train. Is it before you want to get hurt or after, when you've already gotten hurt? But either way, you're going to need to do it. Right.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah. That's it's so true. And I think of it for myself where there when I first started running, I just ran. That's all I did. I just ran. And I'd say it's probably within maybe the last 4 years or so where I have started to incorporate the strength training more. And it was because I had ran the Chicago Marathon in 2017 and had an awful experience. Like, it was the worst marathoning experience ever.
Oh
Like, I
no.
always tell people, I'm like, you know how you set like your A goal, B goal, C goal, D goal? I'm like, that was like a Z goal
Oh
race.
my
Like
gosh.
the entire alphabet. And it was after that race that I hired a coach, because I didn't like how I felt when I finished.
Yeah.
And so the next year I went back to Chicago, and I call it like my redemption. It was like my redemption race. And the entire cycle and the lead up for that, it was, I wanted to feel strong. Like, that was
Yeah.
just it. I was like, I want
Yeah.
to feel strong. And that's when I started incorporating more strength work. I had always done almost side by side with running was yoga, but
Mm-hmm.
it's a different modality. Whereas strength training, it's like, no, 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 like you're literally giving your muscles the tools that they need to run longer, harder. Like, it truly is a
Yeah.
gift for yourself, even if you don't
Yeah.
it. But now, as I'm looking into the London Marathon, and obviously, like, I'm also an older, not older, but I have gotten older, and I've taken it upon myself to learn about, women. What do women need as they grow older? What do women need? Because me as a runner in my 20s is very different than where I'm at right now in my 30s, and it'll be very
Mm-hmm.
different. I will be in my 40s. And it's,
Mm-hmm.
oh, everything I see is for women in particular. It's strength training is so important. And strength training by lifting heavy weights is really important. So I'm like, all right, even for me now, going into, I've seen the benefits of strength training, but now going into this training cycle for London, I'm like, all right, we're not going to bullshit ourselves. Like, when we
Yeah.
lift, we're going to lift. Like, we are going to
Right.
actually put in the effort to challenge myself, like put in the effort to really, like, how heavy can I lift? How
Yeah.
strong can I feel? And that takes a mental shift, because it is hard to manage. No one wants to feel sore when they're running, right?
Yes.
Like, no
Yes.
one wants to feel sore. And yet I've learned in my experience that, okay, but the soreness, that's just my body adapting. So if I can see it as my body adapting and allowing it to kind of maybe the run feel a little bit harder, but what I'm actually doing is strengthening myself overall. As soon as my body, at least this has been my experience, right? Where it's like, once I adapt to the load, then the running, I feel like running catches up to everything else that you're doing, versus kind
Yeah.
of what you said, where like not using the strength training to catch you up to running, but using the strength training to keep you in line with running.
Yes. Yeah. I think I always tell people too, if you like, your goal is to be running the rest of your life, like as long as possible, you got to strength train, because every time you run, right? I tell this to people all the time too. Every time you run, every time you land and heel strike, that's 2.5 times your body weight going through your body. Right. So you need to be able to accept those loads. And the more you strength train, the more you're able to tolerate those loads at more of a distance, right? Because every time, if you're running 3 miles that's going to be a lot less on your body than if you run a 15-mile long run, right? So the more you strength train, the more you get that tissue capacity to withstand heavier loads, the more it's going to benefit you when you're actually running, and it might stink in the meantime to be a little bit sore. But if you have someone periodizing your plan correctly and you're starting to decrease the load a little bit more, and then eventually you kind of taper off and you have like a week or two of like just mobility before your race, you're going to feel really, really good. And that also goes back to like, if you're lifting heavy, like this is also why you just need to periodize as a whole, your whole year. If you're, for you, like if you're running London in the fall, right now is a great time to really be lifting heavy. I wouldn't recommend like trying to lift your heaviest in the middle of your marathon season. But you just have to be thoughtful about how people do it. And that is what's going to set you up for as much success as possible. Because I completely understand, like, do not try and put up your PRs with your weights in the gym if you have a 20-mile long run the next day.
Right.
Like that's brutal. I 100% agree. But a little bit of soreness, if you have an easy run scheduled the next day, if you schedule it like that, where you're doing legs and then an easy run, all right, well, that actually will help with the soreness,
Yeah, so, it's kind of, it even plays into that concept where I feel like we hear often of like running on tired legs, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
Right? Running on tired legs doesn't mean you're just running on tired legs from running. It can mean you're running on tired legs from that strength workout that you did.
Yeah.
And all of that stuff, I think of it too, is just, it's so beneficial in terms of working on the mental game, because, we know it, that the longer the distance that you run, the more tired your legs are going to get. Those legs at mile 1 of a marathon feel way different than the legs at mile 25 of a marathon.
Yeah.
And yet this kind of all plays together. So if I was an athlete and I was curious about working with you, what is the process like? How do I get in contact with you? Do we have a consultation beforehand? What does that look like? What does working with you as a run coach look like?
Yeah. So typically, I mean, everyone reaches out to me on different platforms. I'm very, very active, I would say the most on Instagram. So sometimes I'll get DMs on Instagram, but I also get DMs through Facebook. I'm part of a lot of Facebook pages. And I do have a website. So it really depends. Like sometimes I'll get emails too. But regardless, the number one thing that I start with is a phone consult. Like we'll do a free phone consult and we'll talk about like, what are your goals? What are you typically doing right now? Are you running already, or you're signing up for a half marathon and you haven't ran in years, like trying to get a good sense of like where they are. Do you strength train? Do you do mobility work? Do you do any of that already, or do you need someone to? And then that's when from there, right there, I'm just like, okay, I only like to work with people if they're willing to do that. And most of the time I've actually had, I don't know if it's like the culture of running, people are talking about strength training where people are like, yes, like I need to. So people are a lot more on board with that in terms of that. So yeah, then from there, if you say, okay, do want to do coaching with you, I'm interested, send them a running questionnaire. It's just an intake form that pretty much says like, how long have you been running? What's your age? How many miles do you typically run? What are your PR? Ran any races? Like how long ago was that? Pretty much just get a sense of who they are as a runner. How much of a, I would say like a chronic load have they built up from, if any, to know how much mileage they can handle in the marathon training, right? A lot of times, and this is another mistake I see a lot of people do, like they don't ever run, and they're like, I'm going to do a marathon. And then they do the marathon, and then they just get the plan from online. And it's a lot of mileage. It's a lot of mileage for what they can handle, or it's like more days than they typically would. And they'll do it because they feel like they need to follow this exact plan to run the marathon. And then, they get hurt. But that's another story. I think after people do the questionnaire and stuff, I have final surge. And so I'll
Mhm.
hook them up, make sure they got their watch connected if they have a watch, and I'll upload everything onto Final Search. And from there, we do a lot of our communication through, I look at their workouts that following week. I give them any critiques, I'll text them. As they get closer to a race, we'll phone call or do a video chat and just say like, okay, let's talk about your race strategy. Let's talk about your fueling. Let's talk about your, electrolytes, just everything, so they can feel fully prepared before that race. Like, okay, like what's the warm up you're doing before the race? Because you're not going to just run straight and do a marathon, right? So, yeah, we talk about everything you could possibly think about and any questions or concerns they have leading up to the race, if that's what their goal is. But yeah.
Do you do the plans when you send them their workouts? Is it on a weekly basis, a monthly basis? How do you work that out?
I think it depends on the person. So, like right now, for example, I had someone who was going to run the Marine Corps marathon,
Mhm.
got hurt, hip, had like some hip stuff going on. And then I've been creating like a strength plan since, and we're now just building up back up. So, like, getting him to run, period. So for him, for example, every single week is gonna be different depending on that pain or if he has pain at all. Right now, he has had no pain, like for the, I would say, like past 2, 3 weeks. So probably as we get closer to his half marathon, I'll write up a plan, and then as things change throughout the week, I will adjust the plan as like needed within that week. Um, but up until this point, I've been going week by week because I'm not going to write this whole plan out if he decides to run 6 miles and he's like, oh, I feel the hip again, it's pretty bad. But if I have someone who's generally healthy and has no issues or anything, then I'll typically write the plan, and then every week we talk, and they say, like, I'm not feeling well this week, or I'm like really busy, or can we move this workout, or their weekly live things that will constantly change, will then adjust the plan as a whole within that week. But I'll create their whole plan beforehand. Because I know sometimes people, like, depending on the person too, they also like to see, like, they want to
Yeah.
know, like, okay, what do I have next week? And I completely understand that, because a lot of times I'm like, all right, I know I'm busy next week. Let me try and plan it out on my end too. Or like, let me make sure I can put in the right time. But when life things happen and you can't really control for that, I'll change it.
Yeah. I mean, I've at this point, I'm someone who I don't like to see what I'm doing too far in advance because I'll overthink it or
Yeah.
the doubt might set in. But I love that you have that adaptability because it seems like in either case, whether you have, someone who's healthy or someone who's injured, you have the ability to create the plan in a way that's going to best fit them. And that's
Yeah.
something that I think we in this whole conversation of coaches, sometimes we might miss that where your coach is you really are such a huge tool and support for the runners because of that, because you're able to be flexible enough to understand, okay, how does this person need to train in order for them to have success? Like I think of run coaching as you're going to have a more global view of things. And then once the data starts to come in from each run, like you can solidify the view of a person's training a little bit better than the person when they're going through the training, right? Like
Right.
there is just a different analysis, but also objectivity when it comes to that. As I find that sometimes it's like, oh, that was, what a person perceives as a bad run is actually like, wait, no, this is actually pretty good. Like, yeah, I might have sucked, but when we're looking at the wholeness of what you're trying to do, there are lessons here that you can take into the next run or into the next run.
Right.
So that is really just that whole flexibility of a coach. Like you don't go to a coach just to get a plan.
Yeah. And I think a lot of people don't know that, like, if you want a plan, there are many, many plans out there. Trust me. But you get a coach because you know that your life is life. Like, it's never going to be perfect, right? And so, again, that major problem is people will do something online and they'll push through and do every workout. Like, if you're running 3-4 days per week, and then the max you could do is 5, and then you're doing a plan that's 6 days a week, like not only does that go out and increase your chance of injury, it's just not enjoyable, right? It's just stressful, like to feel like you have to do every single run. And then you start getting in your own head, I didn't do this one run, I'm not going to be set up for success. So I think the coach is nice to be able to say, okay, this is individualized to you. We'll get you there based off of what you need to do. And then I think also in general, luck enough, I've had a lot of people who support me with my running journey, but it does take a time training, and
Yeah.
just it's exhausting sometimes. You're constantly talking about it. It could be annoying to people who aren't runners. So I think having that run coach too is like, all right, I try to be another friend to my clients, like sometimes they don't get as much support from their family or friends because they don't understand it. So I think it's also like having that added support of being a friend and supporting them when they're running, and making sure you're tracking them, and just trying to be as supportive as possible with something that is very, very difficult, I think is also a good reason to have a run coach. Because I know sometimes I've heard they like, oh, my husband or my boyfriend doesn't support me because they understand, and like I'm taking a lot of time out of, if you have kids, like you taking time out of your day to try and run, and schedules are busy and stuff. So if you don't have someone who supports you, it's really, really hard to stay consistent running, especially if you're training for a marathon.
And that is such a beautiful point to make, because it's your run coach loves to talk about running. Like, talk about
Yeah.
someone who wants to go into the nitty-gritty of running and who actually gets joy out of hearing how your running is going. And I love
Yeah.
that you highlight that, where it's like your run coach is a person of support, where you may not have a lot of support in real life. And the reality is that people who aren't runners, people who aren't runners don't understand. Like, that's
No, they
just kind of
don't.
it. Like, they don't understand. It's kind of hard, or maybe they kind of understand, but they don't really get it.
No.
Where
Yeah.
Whereas once you fall in love with running, like, you're all in. And
Mm-hmm.
I think back to like a few summers ago, where I was complaining. Oh my God, I spent so much time complaining about how hot it was. And I remember someone reaching out to me at that point and saying, but like, do you even like running? And I'm like, no, I love running. I just don't like the heat. And I'm going to bitch about it, because it's just, I'm like, I don't know what else to do. I'm still going to go
Yeah.
out there and I'm still going to do it. But it came from, it really made me laugh, because I'm like, okay, maybe I am complaining a little bit too much. But then it was also like, all right, let me talk to my runner friends about this, because they'll understand a little bit better than someone who's viewing it from the outside. And a run coach does that. You really do take an important role of support. And that is something that I tell people as well, kind of going back to what you said about it. An important goal is injury prevention, where it's like, wait, another goal or another consideration that you should have before you take on any big distance is to figure out who is your support system and who is going
Yeah.
to be there to help you along the way. Because the longer the distance, the more time that particular bit of training is going to take.
Yeah. For
All right.
sure. 100%. I think everyone is like, I remember I had a patient who told me that he had a friend who I want to say was training for an Ironman, which is a lot because you're training for a
Yeah.
marathon. Oh my gosh, I can't imagine what training like for an Ironman is, right? And so he did one, and it was a lot. And his wife was like, "Okay, like you're right." And then he got hooked, and then he was doing more and more, to the point that like eventually she wanted a divorce.
Yeah.
Like,
I've heard of that too.
yeah, yeah. And so if you don't have someone in your corner, in your support system, that understands how much work it is and is there for you, it could be really, really hard to want to continue doing it. So I think that is a super important aspect of having a run coach, because sometimes it is lonely, like especially if you're busy and you're not one to have the time to join run groups. Like for me, I don't know. I love run groups. I have a couple of people I'll go to every once in a while, but sometimes I like being alone, and sometimes I just don't
Yeah.
have the time to make it out there. I'm like, I need to fit it within my own schedule. So if you don't have that type of support in person, and you're the person that's running, then it could be
Right.
hard sometimes. Like before I really was, I have my job as a physical therapist, and I just recently started getting into running. I did not have a lot of running friends. It was always just something, and it didn't really matter. When I was running shorter distances, it was just like
Yep.
going to the gym. I had friends who went to the gym, so it was the same time consumption. When I got
Right.
more into running, I'm like, I don't really have a lot of running friends that understand. Now I know a lot of people just through my job that I'm like, okay, well, now I have a lot of people to talk to. I'm lucky enough, my boyfriend, he's not a runner, doesn't really like running, but he's very supportive and was very supportive. I ran the New York City Marathon this year. Like he would bike next to me during my long runs and stuff, and with a water in his hand, ready to give it to
Yeah.
me. But some people I know are like definitely not as fortunate, and that's
Right.
hard.
It is. It is because it's when you're thinking about our time, right? We have a very limited amount of time in a day. And I think of, for instance, my Saturday yesterday, right? I ended up with 9 miles. And when I came home, I took a 2 hour nap. I showered and I took a nap. And I have two kids, I have a husband. And it was one of those things where it's like, they had to, as much as I sacrifice things, the people that are in your inner circle are making sacrifices as well, right? Like my
Yeah.
family had to be okay with me not being a part of whatever activities were happening in the morning because I needed to take that nap. So that is such again, like a really important consideration before tackling any of these distances of, okay, who is going to support me while I do this? Because again, the longer the distance, the harder the training gets, not only on
Yeah.
your body, but emotionally, the more time that you're going to need to recover. And,
Mm-hmm.
like I always say, if you have a bad night, you can maybe power through like a 6 to 8 mile. But if you have a bad night, you're not going to be able to power through an 18 to 22 miler, right? Like,
No,
so it's a lot, like there are a lot of people need to work with you in order to make those goals happen. And I just love that you pointed out where you, as the run coach, can be one of those people when maybe in other areas of life, there aren't people who necessarily understand the
yeah,
importance of the goal, because that's part of it. And yeah, running can be really lonely, but to have the experience normalized, and you said it, right? Like when you have people who know what you're feeling, it makes it a little bit easier to be consistent with all the effort that you're putting into running.
for
So
sure.
I love that so
100%.
much.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. One of the last questions I have, and I ask this for everyone, is how can we make running more accessible?
Yeah, I liked that. So I think that I think there's three ways, right? So number one, just safer communities to run in, right?
Yep.
I know that whole thing that happened over the summer, I want to say it was like just you don't want to be concerned going out for a run that something's going to happen. So I think number one is just having safer communities, and that includes like sidewalks. When
Yeah.
I was in Connecticut for school, some areas just didn't have sidewalks, and it
Mm-hmm.
was like super windy, and so it was scary sometimes because I'm like, oh my god, is a car gonna see me? So I
Right.
would say like safer communities in general, access to like more sidewalks, and access to just more run groups. I think the more run groups there are, the safer you feel regardless, and then you have more of a community anyways, where you do have more of a network where you do again feel safer. I just think that having more support and having the run group to almost like advertise running in a way
Yeah.
makes you more likely. Like if you can find a group that's very similar to you, you're just pretty much finding new friends too. And
Yes.
so it makes it a little bit more like, I don't really want to run, but I want to see my friend. So I'm going to go to this run group. And so I think those are like the three things, safety being the most important, but just in general, having a community as well. And you know, better sidewalks because that's scary too.
Let me tell you, it is. There are definitely, and it's like, it's funny because it's like, not only is it having more sidewalks, but also having sidewalks that are maintained. Because I
Yeah.
feel like sometimes the sidewalks, at least by me, they're, they've got roots or they're parts that are broken off. So it's little things like that that really do make a big, big difference in terms of having running feel and be more accessible.
And street
Uh,
lights too. Sometimes people run outside and
Yes.
that's scary too.
Yeah, streetlights too. You're absolutely right. There's definitely parts of my route now where I don't even know what timer they're on, but like they'll go off and I'm like, no, the sun isn't out yet. Like, why are we going off now? It
Yeah.
shouldn't be going off yet. All right. Final question is tell us where we can find you. What do you have going on? Where can
Yeah.
we interact with you more, get more information, and just anything exciting you may have coming up?
Yeah. So again, I'm pretty active on Instagram, I would say the most. But I have an Instagram, I have a TikTok, so you can follow those with it's just run with cat underscore DPT. And so you can follow me on those, reach out to me if you have any questions on there. Those I also have my website, runwithcat.net. And then I also have a Facebook page. It's the Run with Cat Show. I'm actually starting my own podcast and it's dropping in January. So that's going to be just everything that a runner should know to be the healthiest, happiest, strongest runner. So I'll have a lot of PTs on there. I'll have like run coaches, people who are involved in like the shoe world, and just everything holistic you should or want to know about running to be doing it safely. And so that will drop in January. I have my Facebook page for that. If you wanted to be interested, if you're interested in learning about it or listening to it, join the Facebook page because I'm going to drop the date on there of when I'm officially launching it, but I'm hoping early January.
And
So
on
those are
Facebook,
pretty much.
it's Run with Cat.
Yeah, the Facebook page is the Run with Cat Show. Yeah, and it should come up, but yeah, and I'll drop the date on there.
That's really exciting. I'm going to be excited to listen to these conversations because I just have I love people in the sport who take such a dynamic view of the sport
Yeah,
because it's going to say it a million times until people get tired of hearing it. Being a runner is more than just running.
yeah,
And once we kind of accept how multifaceted we are as athletes, it really does build a different kind of connection to the sport of running and then to the people within that community that really do want to see you be your healthiest, happiest, strongest self. So I can't wait to hear those conversations because there's always something new to learn as well. Like we're not,
yeah,
again, as I shared, it's like the older I get, the more I need to learn in order to continue this relationship with running for as long as I want to continue it.
right.
So,
I always tell people too, like if you want to run, the only difference between a pro and you should be the fact that they're really fast and they do it like, you know, as a career. But regardless, if you're a runner, you should also be training like a pro. You don't need to be running the same paces as them, but they're doing all these things. And this is why they're as great as they are. So if you do the same things, you'll get there. You'll be your best potential. It doesn't need to be the same paces as them, but you can still reach a very, very high potential that you didn't know you had.
that is such a beautiful thought to end with because I really do think and I don't know if this is more just now, again, like that access of information, because I love, I follow a bunch of pro runners. And when I see their strength workouts or their prehab stuff, I'm like, oh, I can totally do that. Like, wait, what? Whereas before, I feel maybe, 10 years ago, that access of information wasn't there. So I
Yeah.
just thought, oh, they run and they run fast. Now I'm
Yeah.
like, oh, wait, they're actually like, they're showing us what some of their gym workouts are. They're showing us some of the things that they do. So to your point, and I'm just so grateful that you brought it up, where it's like, oh wait, we can bridge the gap. The difference truly is that they run really fast, but we can all do the same things to meet whatever our potential is. And that's
Right.
just such a beautiful, beautiful message to leave this conversation with. And I'm just so grateful that you were on the podcast and that you shared so much. I really, after this discussion, I'm even more pumped about my strength training. Like, I'm not going to look at it this week and be like, now I'm going to look at it like I'm going to have that in mind of, wait a minute, if the pros are doing it, I can do it too, kind of thing. Like, just
Yeah.
that, where it's like, oh, wait, this is something that we do. It's just beyond what is scheduled. This is actually like, oh yeah, if I want to be in this sport long term, if I want to reach my potential, and if it's good enough for the pros, it is more than good enough for me.
Right. Exactly.
So I thank you all for listening. Thank you, Kat. Please make sure to give her a follow, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you so much for having me.
You're welcome. All right, bye everybody.